The smell of death hung in the air of West Auckland, County Durham, in the summer of 1872. It wasn't unusual for the narrow, coal dust-covered streets of northern England to reek of disease and poverty. But there was something different about the house on Front Street, something that made neighbors whisper behind closed doors and cross to the other side of the road when they passed. Inside that modest two-story dwelling lived a woman the community knew well, Mary Ann Cotton, a widow, again, for the fourth time in fact. Her latest husband, Frederick Cotton, had died just 14 months earlier. Stomach fever, the doctor had said, terrible tragedy. And now she was caring for her 7-year-old stepson, Charles Edward Cotton, all alone. Or rather, she had been caring for him, until July 12th, when the boy stopped breathing. The local officials barely blinked. Child mortality was staggeringly high in Victorian England. Cholera, typhoid, scarlet fever, diphtheria, these diseases swept through working-class neighborhoods like the Grim Reaper's scythe, cutting down the young and the weak without mercy. One more dead child was hardly worth investigating. The parish would arrange for burial. Life would go on. But Thomas Riley, a local official who had known Mary Ann for years, felt something gnawing at his conscience. He couldn't quite place it at first, just an uncomfortable sensation in his gut whenever he thought about that house on Front Street. Then he remembered a conversation from just days before Charles Edward's death. Mary Ann had come to his office, asking about admitting the boy to the workhouse. Riley had told her it was impossible while the child still lived. Her response had been cold, matter-of-fact. "Perhaps it won't matter. I won't be troubled long. He'll go like all the rest of the Cotton family." At the time, Riley had assumed she meant the boy would die of natural causes, like so many other children in their poverty-stricken town. But now, standing over the small coffin, those words echoed differently in his mind. He'll go like all the rest of the Cotton family. All the rest: Frederick Cotton, 2 of Frederick's children from his previous marriage, Mary Ann's own infant son, Robert, and those were just the recent deaths. Riley's hands began to shake as he realized he couldn't remember how many funerals he'd attended that were connected to this woman. 5, 10, more. Against all protocol, against the wishes of the local doctor who had already signed the death certificate, Thomas Riley demanded a post-mortem examination. The physician protested. After all, he'd examined the boy and found the classic symptoms of gastric fever. The stomach cramps, the vomiting, the convulsions. All textbook signs of natural disease. But Riley insisted, and when the surgeon finally opened Charles Edward Cotton's small body, he found something that made his blood run cold. The boy's stomach and intestines were inflamed, yes, but there was something else. A residue, a crystalline substance coating the tissue. He preserved the organs in jars and sent them to Leeds for analysis. The answer came back within days: arsenic. Enough arsenic to kill 3 grown men, concentrated in the body of a 7-year-old child. The police arrested Mary Ann Cotton on July 18, 1872. She protested her innocence with theatrical tears and desperate pleas. How could they accuse her of such a monstrous crime? She was a mother, a widow who had suffered more than any woman should have to endure. She had lost 4 husbands, 13 children, a lover, a friend, her mother, and several stepchildren to disease and misfortune. Was she now to be blamed for the cruel hand of fate? But as investigators began pulling on that thread, the fabric of Mary Ann Cotton's life started to unravel, revealing something far more horrifying than anyone had imagined. This wasn't a story of bad luck or divine punishment. This was a carefully constructed empire of death, built over 2 decades by a woman who had turned murder into a business model. Mary Ann Cotton was born Mary Ann Robson in October 1832 in the village of Low Moorsley, County Durham. Her childhood was unremarkable by Victorian working-class standards, which is to say, it was brutal. Her father, Michael Robson, worked as a miner in the treacherous coal pits that honeycombed the earth beneath northern England. When Mary Ann was just 8 years old, he fell down a mine shaft and died. Her mother remarried quickly, survival demanded it, and young Mary Ann learned the first and most important lesson of her life. Security came through marriage, and marriage was a transaction. At 16, Mary Ann took work as a nurse at the Sunderland Infirmary. This was not the skilled medical profession we know today. Victorian nurses were often little more than domestic servants who emptied bedpans and changed soiled linens. But it was here, among the dying and the desperate, that Mary Ann received an education in chemistry that would prove deadly. She watched doctors administer medications, learned which substances eased pain and which ones stopped hearts, observed how symptoms of poisoning mimicked natural diseases. She was 20 when she married William Mowbray, a laborer on the railways. They moved frequently, following work across northern England, and the bobbies came, one after another, as they always did in that era before reliable contraception. Mary Ann gave birth to 8 children between 1853 and 1864. 5 of them died in infancy or early childhood. This would not have seemed suspicious at the time. Infant mortality rates in industrial England hovered around 30%. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, overcrowded housing, and primitive medical knowledge created a perfect storm of childhood diseases. Families expected to lose children. Grief was a constant companion in every household. But there was something Mary Ann understood that made her different from other grieving mothers. Dead children were worth money. The Victorian era saw the rise of industrial life, insurance, small policies that working-class families purchased to ensure they could afford a proper burial when tragedy struck. For just a few pennies a week, a mother could insure her children's lives. And when those children died, as so many did, the insurance company would pay out enough to cover the funeral costs and perhaps leave a little extra. Mary Ann began collecting those payments. When 8-year-old Margaret Jane Mowbray died in 1860, there was insurance money. When 5-year-old John Robert followed in 1864, there was more. The family's circumstances improved noticeably after each small funeral. Then, in January 1865, William Mowbray himself died. Gastric fever, the doctor wrote. His widow collected on his life insurance policy and within months had moved back to Seaham Harbor, where she quickly married George Ward, an engineer. George Ward lasted 14 months. He died in October 1866, his death certificate citing intestinal disorder and fever. Mary Ann collected his life insurance, packed her bags, and moved to Pallion, where she secured a position as a housekeeper for James Robinson, a recent widower with 5 young children. This was Mary Ann's pattern, refined and perfected. Marry men with steady incomes and life insurance policies, or take positions caring for households where death could be explained away as natural misfortune. She was a shapeshifter, adapting her story and her persona to whatever situation offered the most opportunity. She could be the devoted wife, the caring mother, the sympathetic nurse, the helpful friend, whatever mask was needed to gain trust and access. Within weeks of arriving at the Robinson household, tragedy began to strike. James Robinson's infant son John died. Then 10-month-old James, Robinson's youngest, followed his brother to the grave. Mary Ann consoled the grieving father, her gentle touch and soft words easing his pain. They married in August 1867, barely 10 months after she'd entered his home. Mary Ann brought her own children to the marriage, or rather, she brought some of them. Her daughter Isabella was still alive, as was her son from William Mowbray. But during her time in the Robinson household, something strange happened. Her own mother, Mary Robson, came to visit and died within days. Stomach illness. Then Isabella, just 8 years old, perished shortly after. Same symptoms. Violent stomach cramps, uncontrollable vomiting, convulsions, death. James Robinson's older children, who had survived their new stepmother's arrival, noticed something disturbing. After each death, Mary Ann would make trips to collect insurance money. She seemed almost cheerful in the days following funerals. and she had developed a habit of making a particular beverage for those who were ill, a tea she prepared herself, allowing no one else to help. But James Robinson had something that protected him: suspicion, and more importantly, control of his own finances. When he refused to let Mary Ann take out additional life insurance policies and questioned her about missing household items she'd been pawning, their relationship soured quickly. Mary Ann left him in 1869, the only husband she would abandon rather than bury. She moved to Walbottle, where she took up with a mine manager named Frederick Cotton. Frederick was married, but his wife Margaret was sickly and weak. Mary Ann moved in as a housekeeper and nurse to help care for the ailing woman. Within months, Margaret Cotton was dead. Gastric fever again. Frederick married Mary Ann with unseemly haste. The pattern accelerated. Frederick Cotton died in September 1871, just 14 months after marrying Mary Ann. His death certificate listed gastric fever. His 2 sons from his first marriage, also living in the household, followed their father to the grave within a year: 10-year-old Frederick Jr. in March 1872 and 9-year-old Charles in May. Each death was attributed to natural causes. Each death came with an insurance payout. Mary Ann had also given birth to 2 children during her time with Frederick Cotton. The first, a boy she named after his father, died at 14 months old in 1871. The second, Robert, died at 15 months in 1872, just weeks before his half-brother Charles Edward, the death that would finally expose Mary Ann's crimes. During this period, Mary Ann also managed to kill Joseph Natress, a former lover who had reappeared in her life. He moved into her household after Frederick Cotton's death, perhaps hoping to rekindle their romance or perhaps simply needing a place to stay. He died within weeks of arrival, exhibiting the same telltale symptoms: the violent stomach pains, the retching, the convulsions, the slow spiral toward death that Mary Ann had orchestrated so many times before. The mechanism of her murders was devastatingly simple. Arsenic was everywhere in Victorian England. It was the main ingredient in rat poison, which every household purchased to combat the vermin that infested their homes. It was used in wallpaper dyes, creating fashionable green patterns that slowly released toxic vapors. It was even used in some medications and cosmetics. A woman could purchase arsenic-laced rat poison from any chemist without raising suspicion. Mary Ann would extract the arsenic through a simple process, mixing the poison with water and allowing the arsenic to separate and concentrate. She would then administer it gradually, mixed into food or drink, over the course of days or weeks. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning, violent stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, convulsions, were identical to many common Victorian illnesses like cholera, typhoid, and gastric fever. Doctors rarely questioned these diagnoses, especially in poor neighborhoods where such diseases were rampant. The gradual poisoning was key to Mary Ann's success. A sudden, massive dose of arsenic would have been obvious, but small doses, administered over time, mimicked the progression of natural disease. The victim would seem to improve, then worsen, then improve again, exactly as one might expect with infections that came and went in waves. By the time death arrived, it seemed like the inevitable conclusion of a lengthy illness. And Victorian medical practice worked in Mary Ann's favor. Post-mortem examinations were rare, expensive, and considered undignified. Doctors relied on external symptoms and family testimony when signing death certificates. If a grieving widow or mother described symptoms consistent with gastric fever, and if the deceased had been ill for days or weeks, the doctor would likely accept that diagnosis without question. After her arrest in July 1872, investigators began the grim work of exhuming bodies. Charles Edward Cotton's organs had tested positive for arsenic. What about the others? Authorities secured permission to dig up Joseph Natress, Frederick Cotton Jr., and Robert Cotton. Each examination revealed the same horrifying truth: arsenic. Quantities of arsenic that could not possibly have been accidental. Quantities that proved deliberate, repeated poisoning. The investigation expanded. How many people had Mary Ann Cotton killed? The true number would never be known with certainty. Many of her victims had been buried years earlier, their graves long since disturbed or their bodies too decomposed for reliable testing. But investigators compiled a list of suspicious deaths connected to Mary Ann. Her mother, 3 husbands, 1 lover, a friend, 13 children, and 3 stepchildren. 21 people in total, possibly more. The mathematics of her crimes were as cold as they were calculated. Each death had brought Mary Ann financial benefit, whether through insurance payouts, inheritance, or the removal of financial burdens. She had turned death into income, systematically eliminating anyone who stood between her and security, comfort, or a better marriage prospect. Her trial began at Durham Assizes on March 5, 1873. The prosecution had physical evidence, arsenic in the exhumed bodies, and witness testimony from neighbors, doctors, and officials who remembered Mary Ann's disturbing pattern of deaths. They presented Thomas Riley's testimony about her chilling statement that Charles Edward would go like all the rest. They brought forward evidence of the insurance policies, the pattern of deaths following marriage or employment in households. Mary Ann's defense attorney faced an impossible task. He argued that arsenic was so prevalent in Victorian homes that the presence of the poison didn't prove murder. Perhaps the victims had accidentally ingested arsenic from contaminated food, water, or even the green wallpaper that adorned many homes. Perhaps Mary Ann was simply an unlucky woman who had witnessed more than her share of tragedy. But the jury wasn't convinced. The pattern was too consistent, the arsenic concentrations too high, the financial motive too clear. After 90 minutes of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty for the murder of Charles Edward Cotton. The prosecution chose to try her for only 1 murder, knowing that conviction on a single count was sufficient to secure the death penalty. Mary Ann Cotton was sentenced to hang. She maintained her innocence until the end, though her protestations rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. She claimed she was pregnant, a common tactic among condemned women, as British law prohibited the execution of pregnant prisoners. A medical examination proved this was false, though some sources suggest she may have miscarried or given birth shortly before her execution. On March 24, 1873, Mary Ann Cotton was led to the gallows at Durham County Jail. She was 40 years old. The execution was botched, the drop was miscalculated, and rather than breaking her neck instantly, she slowly strangled at the end of the rope for 3 agonizing minutes before finally dying. Some saw this as divine justice for a woman who had caused so much suffering. Others viewed it as one final indignity heaped upon a woman who had been shaped by poverty, desperation, and a society that offered women few paths to security beyond marriage. The case of Mary Ann Cotton shocked Victorian England and captured newspaper headlines for months. She became known as the Black Widow of Durham and the Angel of Death. Her crimes challenged comfortable assumptions about femininity, motherhood, and domesticity. Women were supposed to be the gentle angels of the hearth, the nurturing caretakers of home and family. The idea that a mother could systematically poison her own children, that a wife could murder husband after husband, was almost incomprehensible. Yet there was something disturbingly logical about Mary Ann's crimes when viewed through the lens of Victorian economics. She was born into desperate poverty with few options available to improve her circumstances. Marriage was the only real path to security for working-class women, but marriage also meant endless childbearing, grinding domestic labor, and financial dependence on men who might be abusive, alcoholic, or simply unable to provide adequately. Life insurance created a perverse incentive structure. A living child was a mouth to feed, a constant expense. A dead child brought an insurance payout. A living husband might be a drunkard or a brute. A dead husband left a widow free to remarry, hopefully to someone better, with a small nest egg from the insurance policy. For a woman with few scruples and some knowledge of poison, the arithmetic was brutally simple. This doesn't excuse Mary Ann Cotton's crimes. She was a serial killer who murdered children, including her own offspring, with cold calculation. But it does help explain how such a monster could be created. Victorian society viewed women as inherently moral and maternal, incapable of such violence. This blindness allowed Mary Ann to operate with impunity for 2 decades. Doctors didn't suspect her because mothers don't poison their children. Neighbors didn't report her because widows need sympathy, not suspicion. Each death was tragic but explainable. No one connected the dots until Thomas Riley finally asked the obvious question: how could one woman be so unlucky? The answer, of course, was that luck had nothing to do with it. Mary Ann Cotton wasn't unlucky. She was methodical. She was patient. She was ruthless. And she understood that Victorian society's blind spots, its unwillingness to suspect women of violence, its acceptance of high mortality rates, its primitive forensic capabilities created the perfect environment for her particular brand of evil. After her execution, medical students at Durham University requested her body for dissection and study. They wanted to understand if there was something physically different about her brain or organs that could explain her capacity for such evil. They found nothing. Mary Ann Cotton was, by all physical measures, an ordinary woman. Her evil resided not in malformed tissue, but in a mind that had learned to view human life as a commodity, to be preserved or destroyed based purely on financial calculation. Her case led to reforms in how suspicious deaths were investigated and in how life insurance was regulated. The insurance industry began requiring more thorough medical examinations before issuing policies and investigating claims more carefully when multiple policies were held on one family. Coroners became more willing to demand post-mortem examinations when death seemed convenient or when a pattern emerged. The use of arsenic as a poison declined as it became more tightly controlled and as forensic techniques for detecting it improved. But perhaps Mary Ann Cotton's most lasting legacy is as a dark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it looks like a grieving widow, a devoted mother, a helpful nurse. Sometimes it operates in plain sight, hiding behind society's assumptions about who is capable of violence and who is not. The house on Front Street in West Auckland still stands, though it has been renovated and modernized over the decades. Locals say it's haunted, that on certain nights, you can hear the sound of children crying or catch the acrid smell of arsenic in the air. Whether these stories are true or merely the imaginings of people who know the building's dark history is impossible to say. What is certain is that Mary Ann Cotton murdered at least 15 people, possibly as many as 21, over the course of 2 decades. She killed her own children, including infants she had recently nursed. She killed the men who loved her and married her. She killed anyone who stood between her and financial security or freedom. She did all of this without apparent remorse, maintaining her innocence even as overwhelming evidence proved her guilt. In the pantheon of British serial killers, Mary Ann Cotton holds a unique place. She was the first woman in Britain to be convicted as a serial killer in the modern sense, someone who killed multiple victims over an extended period for personal gain. Her crimes predated Jack the Ripper by 15 years, yet she's far less famous, perhaps because her methods were subtle rather than sensational, domestic rather than dramatic. Her trial transcripts and the newspaper coverage from 1872-1873 reveal a woman who was intelligent, manipulative, and utterly devoid of empathy. When questioned about the deaths of her children, she showed no grief, only irritation at being inconvenienced by the investigation. When confronted with evidence of arsenic poisoning, she had ready explanations. Perhaps it was in the wallpaper, or the children had gotten into rat poison, or the doctors were mistaken. She never broke down, never confessed, never showed the remorse that might have made her seem human. This lack of emotion is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Mary Ann Cotton's story. She wasn't killing in a fit of rage or passion. She wasn't defending herself from abuse or protecting her children from suffering. She was simply removing obstacles to her own comfort and security with the same casual efficiency that one might use to clear weeds from a garden. The Victorian public was fascinated and horrified by her trial. Broadsheet ballads were written about her crimes, sold for pennies on street corners. One popular verse went, "Mary Ann Cotton, she's dead and forgot she lies in her grave with her sins in a jar. But you'll not get to heaven if you're hateful and rot, the devil is waiting for Mary Ann Cotton." The ballad's popularity speaks to the public's need to transform her into a cautionary tale, a monster safely contained in rhyme and melody. But Mary Ann Cotton was no supernatural evil. She was a product of her time and circumstances, a woman who made monstrous choices in response to limited options. She could have chosen differently. Many women faced the same poverty and powerlessness without turning to mass murder. But she didn't. And in making those choices, she created a legacy of death that rippled through entire families and communities. In the end, standing on the scaffold with the noose around her neck, Mary Ann Cotton must have had a moment of clarity. All her schemes, all her murders, all the insurance money and new husbands and fresh starts, they had led her here, to this cold morning in Durham, to this rope, to this end. The woman who had controlled so much, who had held the power of life and death over dozens of people, now had no control over her own fate. The trapdoor opened, the rope snapped tight, and Mary Ann Cotton, Britain's first female serial killer, paid the only price that society deemed adequate for her crimes. But the questions her case raised about women's agency, about poverty's relationship to crime, about how society's blind spots enable evil, those questions remain unanswered, echoing through the decades to our present day. Her story is not just a historical curiosity or a gruesome tale to be told around campfires. It's a reminder that evil often wears an ordinary face, that trust can be betrayed in the most intimate ways, and that desperation combined with lack of conscience can create a killer as efficient and remorseless as any in history. Mary Ann Cotton killed more people than many famous male serial killers, yet she did it quietly, in her own homes, with nothing more dramatic than a cup of poison tea. That perhaps is the most terrifying aspect of her legacy. She proved that you don't need to be a monster in appearance to commit monstrous acts. You just need to be willing to look at human life as a transaction, to weigh the value of a child's smile or a husband's love against the cold comfort of insurance money, and to choose the money every single time.